He needed Jewish money, he needed Jewish support in Palestine to neutralize Britain's foreign policy agenda for the world. He wanted to cut off Britain from its trade routes to India and Africa. And he set the agenda for the other European powers who, having beaten France, were fighting each other to control the world as well. And so you find in the middle to the latter part of the 19th century, these religious ideas, along with political expediency, blending with British foreign policy. Finney, for example, predicted Jesus would return by 1838. Edward Irving, a Scottish Church of Scotland pastor, along with John Nelson Darby and a number of others, began to hold conferences. They became known as the Albury Circle and then the Powers Court conferences, predicting the end of the world, the revival of the Jewish people back in the land, and the destiny of the church linked to this worldview. Darby, for example, along with Moody and Cyrus Schofield, Darby made 5 or 6 trips to the States in the 1850s, 1860s. He had a profound influence over Moody, James Brooks, William Blackstone, Cyrus Schofield, and what became known as dispensationalism, the idea that God has 2 chosen peoples, the church and Israel, with their own scripture texts, their own destiny, came to replace the traditional view of covenantalism. Covenantalism teaching that God has 1 people, 2 covenants, replaced with the idea that God has 2 peoples and 2 covenants, a heavenly and an earthly people. Blackstone, one of the disciples of Darby, was famous for what's known as the Blackstone Memorial. He got 400 leading Christian and Jewish politicians, bankers, and industrialists to sign a declaration urging the American president to return the Jews to Palestine, linking it to Bible prophecy and God's continued blessing of the American people. Schofield's reference Bible, based on Darby's novel ideas, became the most popular study Bible, at least by the 1950s. Dallas Theological Seminary, founded by Schofield, became the foremost theological seminary propounding these ideas. Back in Britain, as I said, the coalescing of these religious ideas with political ideas came to a head through Lord Shaftesbury. Lord Shaftesbury, a very influential politician, came to the conviction that it was Britain's destiny to return the Jews to Palestine and fulfill the church's responsibility. When his widowed mother-in-law married Lord Palmerston, who was the Foreign Secretary, Shaftesbury was convinced that Britain was being blessed by God and would fulfill her heritage, her destiny. He took out page adverts in the London Times and other journals calling upon Christians in Europe to get behind the restoration of the Jews to Palestine. Herzl's phrase, "a land of no people for a people of no land," was probably borrowed from Lord Shaftesbury, who a generation earlier had described Palestine as a country without a nation, for a nation without a country. The First World Zionist Congress, held in Basel, 3 Christian Zionists were present. William Heschler was the Episcopal chaplain to the British Embassy in Vienna, and he facilitated the opportunities for Herzl and others to meet with the leaders of governments in Europe and to lobby on behalf of the Zionist movement. Again, William Heschler's book, The Restoration of the Jews to Palestine, preceded Herzl's by 2 years. And Herzl's diary records meetings with Heschler. Remember, Herzl was largely skeptical of religious matters. He described this Anglican vicar in these terms: "a sympathetic, gentle fellow with a long grey beard of a prophet, enthusiastic about my solution to the Jewish question. He considers my movement a prophetic turning point which he had foretold 2 years before, predicting the settling of Palestine in 1897. We have prepared the ground for you, said Heschler triumphantly. I take him as a naive visionary. He gives me excellent advice, full of unmistakable, genuine goodwill. He is at once clever and mystical, cunning and naive. Everything that you long for in your local parish priest. Remember, this is what Herzl is describing an Anglican vicar. We have prepared the ground for you. We Christians have prepared the ground for you, Jews. David Lloyd George was converted to Zionism through acetone. Chaim Weizmann was a chemist working at Manchester University. We were locked in conflict with Germany, and Weizmann gave the British acetone, a form of synthetic TNT, and it helped us defeat Germany in the First World War. James Arthur Balfour, probably the most influential Christian Zionist of the 19th century, saw his role and British politics as an instrument for carrying out the divine purpose. You may not know, but it's a fact of history that the Balfour Declaration was written by the Zionist organization. It went through several drafts. They expected the British government to create Israel as a state. Britain's agenda, if you know something of British history, was to bless the peoples of the world in the British Empire. We had no plans to allow anyone to become independent. We'd lost America. We weren't going to lose anyone else. And therefore we were offering the Jews a homeland. We were not offering them a state. We were offering them the blessing of the British Empire. And it took us 40 years to figure out they didn't want that. But interestingly, you have the famous Balfour Declaration where we promised the Jews a homeland, we promised to respect the rights of the Palestinians, and we promised also Jews living in other parts of the world that they didn't have to go and live in Palestine, because there were anti-Semites who used the Balfour Declaration to get rid of the Jews. Interestingly, again, it's a historical fact. The Balfour Declaration was published prematurely to beat the Germans, because the Germans were about to do the same. The Germans and the British in the middle of the First World War were both turning to the Jews to help them beat the other side, in the same way that the French and the British used the Jews to try and defeat the other side in the Napoleonic Wars. So we got in first. But just think what history might have happened if Germany had promised the Jews a homeland in 1918. The consequences of the Shoah might have been different. But this is confession time. British Prime Minister, for in Palestine we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. The four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes of far profounder import than the desires or prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. As far as Palestine is concerned, the powers have made no statement of fact, which is not admittedly wrong, and no declaration of policy, which at least in the letter we haven't always intended to violate. And the reason for that is because Britain and France had agreed secretly we were going to split the Middle East. The British and the French had agreed in 1915 to split the Middle East after they'd beaten the Germans. So we had no intention of giving Palestine either to the Jews or the Arabs. We were promising the French we were going to keep it to ourselves. This is the corruption of empire. The British mandate was an attempt to contain and limit the rights of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs to enjoy the benefits of the British Empire. We were trying to work out a solution, and it took us 40 years to figure out the partition plan of 1947, where we were going to split Palestine between the Jews and the Arabs. As you know, the Israelis, the Jews, accepted that plan. The Arabs rejected it. The War of 48 led to the armistice lines, to the War of 67, and to the contemporary situation. What's happened since 67? Well, 67 was the trigger. Within the evangelical world, Christianity Today, Nelson Bell was the editor, father-in-law of Billy Graham, seeing the Six-Day War as a sign prophecy is coming true. Jimmy Carter, 78, again, seeing the state of Israel as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. He's done a 180-degree turn since then, but in 2003, the Pew Research Center showed that 63% of American white evangelicals agree with that statement. Coalition developed in '76 between an evangelical president, Menachem Begin, a right-wing prime minister, and Jerry Falwell. Coalition emerged, and through the strength of that tripartite coalition, significant things happened in the American scene. Jerry Falwell was the suitor for that relationship. In 1979, the Israeli government gave him a Learjet to assist him in his advocacy work on behalf of Israel. James Brooks, William Blackstone, Cyrus Schofield, and what became known as dispensationalism, the idea that God has two chosen peoples, the church and Israel, with their own scripture texts, their own destiny, came to replace the traditional view of covenantalism. He needed Jewish money, he needed Jewish support in Palestine to neutralize Britain's foreign policy agenda for the world. He wanted to cut off Britain from its trade routes to India and Africa. And he set the agenda for the other European powers who, having beaten France, were fighting each other. Irving, a Scottish Church of Scotland pastor, along with John Nelson Darby and a number of others, began to hold conferences. They became known as the Albury Circle and then the Powers Court conferences, predicting the end of the world, the revival of the Jewish people to control the world as well. And so you find in the middle to the latter part of the 19th century, these religious ideas, along with political expediency, blending with British foreign policy. Finney, for example, predicted Jesus would return by 1838. Edward people back in the land, and the destiny of the church linked to this worldview. Darby, for example, along with Moody and Cyrus Schofield, Darby made 5 or 6 trips to the States in the 1850s, 1860s. He had a profound influence over Moody.